There's a lot going on out there. We have the mainstream media desperate for someone to take down Donald Trump. Here's an idea that I have for the establishment. Just start doing what the people want, and you won't have to worry about outsider candidates because your own candidates will do really well. And so we moved to Marco Rubio. Where, look, Marco Rubio came in as a kind of populist Tea Party favorite. He was going to shake up the system, and then he gets to Washington, and he gets co-opted by McCain and Lindsey Graham and the Chamber of Commerce, and he just becomes one of the guys at the club that is Washington, D.C., in the Capitol. And so all that people liked about Rubio, a lot of it has come into question because, of course, the immigration and so forth. But nevertheless, there is a major effort, well-heeled, underway to package Marco Rubio as Reagan-esque. And I would say, were it only so.
He actually did, and I've seen Ronald Reagan in the same ballroom in 1978. Rubio did better than Reagan did at that same period in the campaign 40 years later. He's the best speaker that I've encountered since 1976 on the trail.
Marco Rubio. I look at him, they say he's a young Ronald Reagan. I said, I don't think he's a young Ronald Reagan. And besides that, I have far better hair than he does, okay?
Is Rubio the next Reagan? That's the question on the table, because I think by the end of it, when I say by the end of the next 2 months, that's what the establishment GOP is going to want you to think. He's the real Reagan. Ted Cruz or someone like a Donald Trump, forget it. And there's a piece in Politico, as Cruz gains GOP senators rally for Rubio, the idea of a Cruz nomination makes fellow GOP senators shudder. Why? He exposed them for what they are. That's why they don't like him. Joining us now, Craig Shirley, Reagan biographer, his latest, Last Act. Huge bestseller on Reagan's legacy, his final send-off from the Reagan funeral to the legacy. He joins us now. Craig, great to talk to you, my friend. How are you?
Hi, Laura. How are you?
I'm very well. Congrats on all the success.
Thank you.
With Last Act. I think of the phrase Last Act. The country's in a last act if we don't turn this thing around. And it was a last act. Yeah, it's our last act. It's a last act for nationalism, populism, under assault by this mass immigration, refugee resettlement, replace the electorate as fast as possible. Then all of a sudden we're hearing that old Rubio, he's the Reagan of the bunch. What is your sense, given everything you know about Reagan? Well,
first off, let me say is that F. Scott Fitzgerald aphorism doesn't apply to the United States. We've had many, many second acts in this country, and I think we'll go on continuing having a second act, so that's the good news. Whether or not Marco Rubio is another Ronald Reagan, I think is problematic at best. Reagan never embraced the neocon philosophy. In fact, he rejected it, said so in his diaries, was noted by other Reagan biographers. Is that, ultimately the difference, I think, Laura, between Reagan's view of foreign policy and anti-Soviet foreign policy was the Reagan doctrine was really about the spreading of ideas more than anything else, which is why he gave so many speeches, not just in the United States against Soviet communism, but in Ottawa and in London, other parts of Europe. And so it really is that to him, what he believed was the way to beat an idea was with a better idea. So it wasn't about, projecting American power, into, third world countries, but instead arming indigenous forces so they could fight for themselves, like the Nicaraguan Contras or the Afghan Mujahideen.
So for someone like a Rubio who has discussed ground forces in Syria, and it's usually fairly vague. I mean, it's someone like a McCain or Graham who will go in
supporting the toppling of Gaddafi in Libya.
Right, exactly. So when you say Reagan rejected the neoconservative philosophy, tease that out a little bit more for us. Give us a little more.
For instance, the neocons believed, as of 1980, that the Soviet Union was a thing of permanence. The Berlin Wall was a thing of permanence, and the long twilight struggle between East and West would go on forever. Partially because it kept them relevant, and it kept them important, it kept them getting invited to dinner parties. The last thing they wanted was an upset of their worldview. Reagan comes in with a new idea, which is that we can beat Soviet communism, we can transcend, we can consign Soviet communism to the ash heap of history. This is very upsetting to the established neocon, in Washington and New York and other places. So he never subscribed to their worldview, which included, of course, sending U.S. troops all over the world.
We're talking to Craig Shirley.
Or nation building.
Right, nation building, which leads me to my next point. I gave a talk up on Capitol Hill, and I did that today, believe it or not, before the show, and spoke to about 45 congressmen. It was off the record, so I'm not going to say what any of the congressmen there said.
Which means it'll leak out this afternoon.
And congresswomen, but suffice it to say, I spoke as I speak on the show, which is, in my mind, more of a populist, nationalist, patriotic series of positions on the critical issues of our day. And those are winning arguments that I think
always have been.
They always have been. And people were looking at me like nodding their heads and again, I'm saying nothing different than I would say on the show, but it just reminded me that all of these folks on Capitol Hill or running for president, they all have such an amazing opportunity. They have it all at their feet. They can do it. They can make the same arguments, and they can make them better than Trump.
I think yes, they can, and that's the good news. Is the Republican Party is going through a revolutionary change, and it's returning to its pro-freedom populist roots and throwing off the shackles of big government Bushism and neoconservatism, and returning to an anti-Washington, pro-revolution, pro-political revolution stance, which has always been a winning philosophy for the Republican Party, from Abraham Lincoln to Teddy Roosevelt. Even Eisenhower, you remember the establishment? No, but look at his final address to the American people, taking on the military-industrial complex. Nothing could be more pro-freedom and pro-revolution than that speech right there. And, of course, Reagan understood this intuitively, is that the proper state for the Republican Party is to always be in a state of political revolution, always challenging the conventional wisdom.
We're talking to Craig Shirley here on the Laura Ingraham Show. One of the folks came up to me as I was leaving the building at the Capitol and said, "Laura, you can't believe what K Street does to us." And I said, "Tell me." Yeah. They hammer us. I said, let me guess. The K Street saying you must vote for the Trans-Pacific Partnership because it's going to make their exports better or make their bottom line stronger. It's going to be positive for America. Let me guess. That's what they're saying. Well, that's a lot of what they're saying. I said, well, guess what? All you need to say to them is, I'm sure there is a few little nuggets here or there that's going to be good for your business. But my focus is on what's good for the American people, and these trade deals have been an absolute disaster. And cite chapter and verse the parts of the trade deal that are really bad, which is why we can't have a trade deal that's not amendable. You can't do that. And they agreed, basically.
Yeah, you had said before is that the winning issues have the support of the American people. And again, Reagan understood this intuitively. He wrote in his autobiography about how to conduct military activities overseas. There were 5 points, and one of them was that you had to have the support of the American people, because without that, then everything else is pointless. And Vietnam proved it, and Beirut proved it. In fact, he wrote the 5 points after the disaster of Beirut.
No, and again, American Marines, exploded. 247 killed. It was a dark, dark moment.
Yes.
And Reagan's response was, no, we're going to send in 50,000 ground troops. No, it was, we're going to reexamine what we're doing here.
Exactly.
We're going to do the right thing. What do you think of Trump's comments yesterday where he was saying, look, a lot of people think are trying to make me out to be some isolationist. He said, I'm paraphrasing. I don't know if we have the soundbite, but he said, I'm going to make sure we're strong enough that we avoid World War III. How popular would that be out in the hustings?
What did John Kennedy say in 1961 in his inaugural address? For only when our arms are sufficient beyond doubt can we be certain beyond doubt that they will never be employed. Reagan picked up that mantle in 1980 at the acceptance speech in Detroit, and they both, John Kennedy and Reagan, knew is that the best stance for America is to always be strong, and then enemies don't tempt us or don't threaten us.
Now, and again, we've said this before, Craig, but if Republicans think they're going to win the presidency by touting their support for these big trade deals and thousands of ground troops in the Middle East, I just don't see the support for that.
Resonating in Iowa or New Hampshire, South Carolina, or anyplace else.
I just don't see the constituency for like another big war in the Middle East. I mean, I think people want ISIS killed off, and I think they want America to be strong. Most importantly, they want the border here enforced.
Sure, absolutely. Again, the difference between Reagan and the modern establishment, he was all for spying on communist provocateurs. You know, after Ford became president, he had appointed Reagan to a CIA review commission, and Reagan later wrote about CIA spying, domestic spying, is that he was against keyhole spying of American citizens. But at the time, there were 2,000 communist agents actively working in the United States, and he was all for spying on that. So he was for tactical spying, but not for bulk collection of data of private American citizens. I mean, there was almost always thought that went into his positions. It seems like today is that there's less thought and more just reactive.
Craig, this is what Jonathan Capehart of the Washington Post said in reaction to Trump's meeting with dozens and dozens of black ministers who gathered from across the country. Let's listen.
It's going to take more than one meeting at Trump Tower with black clergy or ministers or from the faith community to sort of scrub the memories of potential African-American voters about what Donald Trump said in terms of the president's legitimacy as an American-born citizen. Other people of color, Muslims, Latinos.
What is your reaction there to Trump's outreach to blacks?
More power to him. I think it's terrific. Is that the only way to spread conservatism is to spread the conservative message, and you don't get converts by just talking to your own people. Just conservatives or people that are typically conservative. You got to talk to. And Reagan believed that as well. 1 week before the 1980 election, he was campaigning in New York City. He campaigned in the barrios of Texas and California. He believed ultimately in his ability to convince an audience to the superiority of his ideas, as long as he had enough time and a microphone. So I would say to Donald Trump is that he's doing exactly what a presidential candidate should be doing, which is reaching out to non-traditional constituencies.
And you point out that Reagan did that in that week before the 1980 election. Can you think of any other Republican candidates for the presidency who really did that type of outreach? I mean, everyone always talks about Jack Kemp, but he lost how many times? I mean,
No, as a matter of fact, it was just the opposite. I think the Republican philosophy was reflective of Spiro Agnew in '68 when he said, he was asked if he was going to campaign in the inner cities. He said no. When you've seen one slum, you've seen them all. Whereas, Reagan went into the Bronx in the fall of 1980, exactly the place where Jimmy Carter had gone in '76 and promised to clean things up, and Reagan went 4 years later, and of course things were completely a mess and even worse. But here's Reagan, a conservative Republican, campaigning after Labor Day in the Bronx, and he really felt bad about their plight. He went away and said, we can leave this, but they're stuck there, and he just felt terrible about it. So I mean, he did believe that conservatism was for all people.
And again, spreading the good news of conservatism properly articulated, a more nationalist, populist vision of American renewal. I think you win big points in communities that traditionally don't like Republicans. You might win 10% more people, maybe. That's a good thing. And I think the Democrats are deathly afraid of their monopoly being busted up. That's what
Well, let me just say this, is that when he left office in January of 1989, he had 44% approval among African Americans. That was historic.
Wow.
Yes.
44% approval?
among African Americans in January of 1980. I mean, it was
unheard of.
Eisenhower-like, and certainly since the time of the New Deal had broken every Republican record.
God bless Craig Shirley. We just love you. Love the book, Last Act. Thank you so much. It's one of our great ideas for Christmas gifts here on the Laura Ingraham Show. Last Act by Craig Shirley.